Hello, Steve Snodgrass here of the Omaha UFO Study Group, affiliated with Nebraska Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, and the UNO MUFON Society, which is MUFON's first university-based student-led membership in the world, based out of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Welcome to this presentation entitled Super UFOlogy, Tools for Testing Jacques Vallee's Interdimensional Hypothesis. Here's where I'd like to start with this one. In an interview with Jeffrey Mishlove on the PBS program Thinking Aloud that aired in the late 1980s, Jacques Vallee said, "From my own point of view, I'm going to be very disappointed if UFOs turn out to be nothing more than visitors from another planet, because I think they could be something much more interesting. I think what the UFO phenomenon is teaching us is that we don't understand time and space." Now, I've argued for the plausibility of the UFO ET hypothesis, that UFOs could be visitors from another planet. Well, absent the ability to test it anyway. Here, Vallee rejects the UFO ET hypothesis for 5 reasons, but one of them in particular is the most compelling, namely that the apparent ability of UFOs to manipulate time and space suggests radically different and richer alternatives. I've been exploring these alternatives in these yearly presentations, offering up what I believe are some valuable excavation tools. In Integral Ufology, I laid out a better way to help us make validity claims on reports of UFOs. In the UFO ET hypothesis, I said it's plausible for very good reasons, just not testable. In the end of ufology, I got lost in the spaghetti works of conflicting reports and confusion from true believers and enthusiasts, and I just gave up. But then I settled on the idea of the universe consisting of some kind of Jedi force that surrounds us and penetrates us and binds the galaxy together, that might help us understand not only our place, but these richer alternatives that might be available to explore. In The Truth About Ufology, I explored how science and mysticism have much in common, and both have similar and valuable tools to arriving at the truth of the UFO ET phenomenon. Now, alien ontology was a philosophical exploration using the metaphor of a virus as a tool to help us understand non-human intelligences, entities, or abstract occasions of experience in need of assimilation. I answered the questions, what are they, where do they come from, and what can we do about it, using this metaphor of a virus as a tool. In the spirit of ufology, I explored in more depth what I think is the correct mental strategy to the UFO ET phenomenon, and how it relates to our attempt to understand matter and mind approaches in science and philosophy. I argued for what I believe is the right mindset and how to avoid spiritual and scientific bypassing, which involve either elevating or reducing the UFO phenomenon beyond what is necessary. What has seemed to have been missing from my presentations about ufology is something pretty obvious. UFOs, the craft themselves. I've focused on the beings, the entities, the non-human intelligences that are said to be in the driver's seat, or at least nearby in the Blecher subtypes. UFOs are the occasions where telepathic communication happens, with or without an entity present. It's the place where the medical and sexual experiments are happening. It's where the lab is located, where upstairs somewhere is someone at the helm, like in the case of Herbert Schirmer, the most famous Nebraska case, with the craft equipped with a star chart, reclining dentist chair, and all the bells and whistles. It's the location where all this stuff happens to account for missing time. UFOs are the place where the dual nature aspect of experiences, and that they're both terrifying and or profoundly meaningful, occur. Not always, but often. In other words, I've not talked about the craft. The silver metallic discs, the cigar-shaped objects, the large triangles, or the saucers with portholes, lights, and landing gear. I've not talked about the craft. I've sort of talked around them, and I'd like to change that. Now, Vallee offered up the IDH, the interdimensional hypothesis, to account for physical craft that manifest in a cloud of electrified fog and make impossible 90-degree turns that would cause a human occupant to resemble Spam in a can, and then race off at impossible speeds or just altogether dematerialize. Now, what could account for a black or metallic object that itself generates psychophysiological effects of missing time, coupled with the after effects of traumatic terror and profound meaning and liberation, and the occasional visage of near-future technologies like Zeppelins, TV screens, flashing lights, and switches? Or in the case of John Foster's experiences in the mid to late 20th century, this composite drawing of various craft that appear from the near future. Well, here's what I'm not going to do. I'll not recount Roswell, I'll not involve the cabal, and I'll not allude to government cover-up. I'll try to get to the most basic point, as I've done in all my presentations, where I've tried to back into the truth, spiraling up to a wide view where the primary focus has to do with the nature of reality and the best our knowledge of physics, biology, and consciousness is offering. I've said before that to understand the UFO ET phenomenon would require us to have a certain, or at least more certain, knowledge about matter, life, and conscious experience. Or, as Jacques Vallee would say, we need to know more about time and space. But the other thing I will not plan to do in discussing the interdimensional hypothesis is rob it of its predictive power. I'm not going to invoke the multiverse. I will not rely on a mathematically convincing set of theorems that suggest just outside our awareness and ability to detect it, we are required to believe anything that has ever happened, has happened, or will be happening, is actually happening, in this moment and all moments, just in another possible universe to which we do not, unfortunately, have any access. No, a successful theory is not one that accounts for every possible happening or outcome, as was the case with Benjamin Rush's use of bloodletting in the 1700s. This is when every outcome, even the death of the patient, confirmed that bloodletting worked. I'm not saying the multiverse or bloodletting could not be useful. We make that clear. At this point, I'm just suggesting the multiverse go the way of bloodletting went in Edinburgh, Scotland. Bloodletting in the Edinburgh medical community was abandoned in practice before it was abandoned in theory. Now, I do have a belief about UFOs, and it's this: reports are evidence. It's not fair to make a summary judgment that they are hallucinations, group hallucinations, misapprehensions, attention seekers, or all just jerks making hoaxes. To do that is simply to deny evidence. Evidence of what, you might ask? Evidence that we don't seem to understand time and space, and evidence that there are radically different and richer alternatives than even the UFO ET hypothesis suggests. Evidence in the form of reports that should be pointing us to the need for a deeper understanding of the cosmos and our place in it. Now, it might surprise you to know this, but I would like my treatment of the IDH to be considered on scientific grounds. I want this to be specific and testable and helpful to us in this universe. My definition of a fact is that which is actually occurring. So as you watch where I'm going and what I'm offering with the IDH, I just need you to ask yourself if the theoretical grounds are sound enough and if the tools I'm offering are helpful to you. In this universe, in your body and mind, and with the actual facts of your own daily experience. Whether this treatment will be helpful to ufology and the culture at large, I guess only time will tell. I'm skeptical, so feel free to be the same. I just hope you're not wishing me to fail at this point. So let's start here. The ET hypothesis versus the interdimensional hypothesis. The idea that you have to pick one or the other. They are either interdimensional travelers or they are inhabitants from other solar systems or galaxies. Now, just like with the virus metaphor, where their viruses seem to be living and non-living, well, what's wrong with ET as being a biological inhabitant from another star system who utilize their knowledge of the nature of deep physics and conscious experience to manifest activity on Earth via what is called another dimension? Well, there's nothing wrong with it. Vallee didn't make this error. As Vallee offered it, the IDH is an extension of the ETH, in that UFOs could come from anywhere. Now, yes, the interdimensional hypothesis needs work to make it a scientific hypothesis, one that is testable and for which we can make predictions. All I'm doing for the moment is looking into UFOs as interdimensionals while abandoning the practice of the multiverse, sticking to just this one. Let's also stick with your personal experience to consider what dimensions are. We are very familiar with the three spatial dimensions, a line that gives us length, a plane that gives us width, and a third that gives us depth to the point we can determine, where something is. It's easy to visualize that. We need this third dimension of time where we talk about when something happened. This gets a lot harder to visualize time since it's a dynamically flowing process where nothing stays the same. So to make it make more intuitive sense, I'll use Eric Julian's description of how time has three dimensions of its own. We experience time in one direction, from past to future. Second, we only ever experience time in the present moment, as that which is actually occurring. And third, we experience density of how time passes. Fast when we reflect on how quickly our children have grown up, or when we're having fun, or slow when we're in a car accident, or watching the clock on a Friday afternoon, or waiting for a pot of water to boil. This is a good way of illustrating the world in which we live, and suggests how radical and rich the alternatives to our experience can be, but let's take it further. For over 100 years now, physicists have been grappling with the implications of relativity and quantum theory, where everything depends on context. We are constantly in a relationship with a universal field, a dynamic and flowing unbroken whole, where our experience of three-dimensional space and the fourth dimension of space-time depends on everything else. We've been forced to abandon a permanent static world of atomistic theories to find indivisible, indeterminate one that is characterized as born of quantum processes, where every possible thing that occurs is the result of distinct processes or different possibilities. It's sort of like everything happens and doesn't happen, but not really. You did actually win the lottery and you lost the lottery when you happen to lose the lottery. In a world you normally experience something as either happening or not happening, it turns out both happened in a superposition where only one actually did. And as if that wasn't odd enough, subatomic particles have this strange ability to communicate their spin simultaneously to one another across great distances, as if there were no distance between them. Whereas everything we know about space is that it takes time to get from your house to the grocery store, this non-locality feature demonstrates that at the tiny quantum level, there is some kind of spooky action afoot that ignores distances across space. The dimensions of this universe are strange enough, that's for sure. All we know so far is that there are four fundamental forces, one that comes from relativity, that's gravity, and three that work from quantum theory, electromagnetism, strong force, and the electroweak force. The challenge for physics has pretty much remained the same for 100 years now. Einstein sought and failed to unify his theory of general relativity with electromagnetism. We seem to know that at 10 to the minus 34 seconds after the Big Bang, there was only one force to begin with. In our search for quantum gravity, a theory that unites all the four fundamental forces of nature, gravity, electromagnetism, strong and weak nuclear forces, the best candidate so far has been string theory, or M theory. Unfortunately, this theory requires 10-dimensional hyperspace and, by implication, the multiverse, which I said already I'd like to abandon. Not in theory, just in practice. My question, if we are to understand our place in this universe, what is the field we're looking for? Well, a field is just a region, a circumscribed area in which conditions take place and play by the same rules. For example, when Penn State beat Nebraska in 1982, a bad call on Beaver Field made Beaver Field longer near the 5-yard line when officials ruled a complete pass that was way out of bounds. 30 years later, in 2012, Penn State scored a touchdown before the runner fumbled the ball on a bad call, which extended Tom Osborne Field another few inches. T-shirts were made, but of course justice was not served because that game had no championship implications. My point is that on and in one field, everything in it needs to play by the same rules. My personal search is for a unified field theory that brings together UFOs and ETs. And how to do that without being anthropomorphic is the greater challenge. So, here's the challenge for the interdimensional hypothesis for UFOs. Subjectively, an IDH needs to account for missing time, telepathic communication, and the dual aspect nature, the terrifying and profoundly liberating nature of these experiences and reports. Objectively, an IDH needs to account for the UFO as an object, a physical object, distinct from the experience of a witness. It must also be autonomous. But we need a physics that has the right field with the same rules to examine it. Intersubjectively, there needs to be an account of our cultural intercourse with UFOs in history, from the chariots of the gods, I don't know if the chariots of fire, that's different, chariots of the gods, or from the ancient Vedic texts 6,000 years ago. We need a good explanation for the cultural impact of UFOs in history as either a cause or an effect, and we need a reliable way to reveal their meaning as it's found within the members of a culture. That's what intersubjectivity means. Now, interobjectively, the IDH needs to have an account that provides for comparative analysis of these craft. What do they have in common? In a way we can glean some kind of structure and pattern to the craft and their behavior. It seems to me that the only way through this is to say at the outset that UFOs are ETs. UFOs are not simply the craft an ET is driving, because the reports indicate UFOs and ET experiences often involve the same psychophysiological phenomenon. An ET experience will be more in depth, more penetrating and perhaps more available to examination from hypnotic regression sessions. But even without hypnosis, which has its own pitfalls as a tool of study, we can say that UFOs and ETs can and do co-occur. They somehow operate in the same field and follow the same underlying rules. We can't reduce a UFO to a physical or objective fact any more than we can reduce an ET experience to mere human imagination. UFOs may include the human imagination and coincide with it, but they don't seem limited to it. I'll refer here back to my original presentation, the first one, Integral UFOlogy, to say that any fact, that is, anything that is actually occurring, has 4 dimensions or aspects from which it can be viewed. Integral theory is useful here because it allows us a wider view, one that says every process, every fact has an inside or interior aspect and an outside or exterior aspect. Likewise, every process has a singular or individual aspect and a plural or collective aspect. This gives us these 4 ways of looking at every phenomenon: subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective. From the point of view of each of these, they all operate within their own field, each with its own rules. You can't reduce one to the other, such as making physical objects obey subjective rules, or just assert without any evidence that every object is a subjective account of direct experience and nothing more. What you can do, and what we need to do, is honor every aspect, every process that is occurring, but discover the field in which all of these aspects are operating and what the rules are that underlie them. For example, you have to be able to look at yourself, your body-mind, so to speak, from all these 4 aspects at once. Your thoughts and feelings, your heart rate, blood pressure, and neural firing, your embeddedness in a cultural context through which you are detecting meaning, and the social system of which you are a part, with all its geopolitical and ecological contexts. You seem to be all of these at once. So I'm proposing we look at UFO craft as if they are revealed in all of these aspects at once. The way to look at all these processes is how they unfold and develop simultaneously, interacting and interplaying with one another. Everything, every process, every occasion of experience, including that of UFO craft, would unfold in a way that can only be understood as that which is actually occurring from moment to moment, as expressed in these domains. Now, these next few slides summarize an attempt to get to the bottom of UFO, ET, and paranormal experiences. These are the tools offered by Jeffrey Kripal in his book The Supernatural, written along with Whitley Strieber. Kripal looks at Strieber's experiences as natural events, but natural events that seem to operate on undiscovered rules that are over and above in terms of what is ordinary, but are still part of the natural world that don't require something supernatural. This is why there's a space between the words super and natural in the title. Now, I have placed Kripal's tools in the categories of integral theory. Subjectively, Kripal says we need to make a cut, that is, distinguish as best we can between the appearance of a thing and what might be the thing in itself, or at least try. Kripal also suggests we examine experiences as they relate to the power contained in sexual experiences, in that they have this dual nature of being both terrifying and liberating, as well as relating them to experiences that involve trauma. Objectively, Kripal points out the effort of every scientific hypothesis as an approximation of an object out there, and how we need to have some sort of theory of energetics, and that these phenomenon seem to correspond with frequencies, energies, electromagnetics, or plasma-like phenomenon. From the intersubjective angle, it's all about meaning. Every phenomenon arises within a culture that must be interpreted through a cultural lens. We have no choice. We are born into a culture. So it's beneficial to doubly imagine phenomena as a combination of projection of one's culture and introjection, as if the world is staring back at us through a two-way mirror. A great example of this I'd like to point is how stories and oral traditions get altered and shaped based on culture, especially pop culture. Brady DeSantis' discussion of the Wendigo in Ojibwe traditions, this is the flesh-eating cannibal monster that gets more hungry as it devours human flesh to the point of eating its own lips, that the Wendigo can be seen as a metaphor for the ego and the tripartite self working its way through Ojibwe cosmology. Now, of course, we can derive added meaning as the monster's characteristics get interpreted and translated into comic book fantasy battles with the Incredible Hulk, and I guess to some extent My Little Pony as well. Correct interpretations come from those who understand and are a part of a particular culture. In this case, ask any fan of comic books. Finally, we need to look at the system of interactions that are involved with paranormal phenomena. They have an anatomy we can study, a structure that has been seen in historical context, so that we can add comparative analysis as a tool of study to look for common threads. I'll not go into any of these any more than this. Just please go read the book for more detail. It's a great book. I've just placed these tools into integral theory to demonstrate how all four perspectives each have their place as we look to a wider field that might govern how all of this works and fits together. Now, in keeping with my theme to stick to this universe in practice, I want to briefly offer an alternative to the multiverse. Roger Penrose's Conformal Cyclic Cosmology offers a reasonable solution to the problem most cosmological models have with the second law of thermodynamics. Penrose gives us a solution of consecutive sequential universes he calls eons. Each eon begins with its own Big Bang, which turns out to be the crossover point at the end of a previous universe, where a final group of supermassive black holes ended with a series of pops that remain visible in the cosmological microwave background of the next universe. This is a way that the entropy of heat dissipation continues to march, but reaches thermal equilibrium at the crossover point between eons. This discovery, incidentally, of gravitational waves that happened recently in the cosmic microwave background were predicted by this model. So we don't have everything all happening at once. We have a series of universes. As we're looking for a field in which all of these perspectives and all these particles in physics operate within the same underlying rules, I need to return to physics as I understand it. Now, in 1964, Peter Higgs and 6 other scientists describe a mechanism that would suggest the existence of subatomic particles, of a subatomic particle that would explain how particles get their mass, while also explaining the incredibly short range of the weak nuclear force. In 2013, the Higgs boson or Higgs field was confirmed. Yay, science! But here's where I'd like this to go with the interdimensional hypothesis. Imagine, if you will, the following explanation of the Higgs field in physics in terms of UFO craft. We have tiny, massless, energyless bits with a charge, particles, connected in a quantum field that interacts with all other charged particles in their own fields. These quantized bits are connected together, all playing by the same rules. A photon is an excitation or vibration in the electromagnetic field, call it a ripple, that moves with a life of its own. A photon packet that can become visible light if it's in the right frequency that the human eye can detect. Now, if a photon is a localized vibrating ripple in the quantized electromagnetic field, then an electron can be seen as a localized vibrating ripple in a quantized matter field that permeates all space in the universe. Electrons and positrons can materialize at any point in space. What's happening is a photon has disturbed the electron matter field and generates the kinds of waves that generate electron particles, which have mass. This is why the simplest description of the Higgs boson or Higgs field is that it gives particles their mass. The stuff that has mass, if it's large enough, operates in a gravitational field with which we are all so familiar. Now remember, this is a description of ordinary reality. We are not in another dimension or universe here. This is the standard model in physics. Ordinary reality, as you appear into depths at the tiniest distances imaginable, into the stuff of which matter is made, well, it gets pixelated. We find a universe that consists of processes governed by uncertainty and probability, where distance is ignored, that collapses into matter that can be experienced in 3 dimensions, which can in turn be holographically reconstructed from a 2-dimensional surface. This very much resembles a virtual reality simulation. Now, for now, I know I'm getting a little off track from UFOs, but stay with me. Back to Roger Penrose. That's the physicist who doesn't see the need to study other universes or the multiverse because we don't have access to it. He developed Twistor Theory in 1967. This is what causal relations look like around a spinning particle and why the theory gets its name. Look at all the twisting going on there. The second illustration is the impossible triangle. This is Penrose's chosen visual illustration, sort of what this Twistor theory means. Recall that in the multiverse, anything and everything actually happens somewhere. Well, that's how I see it anyway. This gives us time travel paradoxes and allows you to have won the lottery in some other universe. Not so in Twistor theory. Whereas in Twistor theory, causal sequences do not fluctuate. What fluctuates is the location and timing of events. All of this happens in our own universe of 3 spatial dimensions and 1 space-time dimension with no time travel paradoxes. In Twistor space, we're not interested in the theory of how particles move and interact within space and time, but rather how space and time themselves are secondary constructs that emerge out of a deeper level of reality. This deeper level of reality, I propose, is a tool that gets us closer to a unified field where every interaction in this universe plays by the same but extraordinary rules. We've already learned that space is bent and can be stretched, and with the Higgs field, we have learned that fundamental particles in space are filled with all sorts of their own fields. In other words, there is no such thing as empty space, really. Just a field in which matter can materialize when it's disturbed by a vibrating ripple. This deeper level of reality is what I mean by the dimension where we find UFOs, where and how they are experienced by a human mind, but in different locations and timing. Here is one final visual illustration by Penrose, one that I believe we must grapple with as we try to figure out an explanation for ordinary reality, if we are to have any hope of understanding the phenomenon of UFOs. Here we have a circular causational loop, not unlike the impossible triangle. Our physical world seems to arise out of an aspect of a Platonic or mathematical world. The mental world we experience seems to arise out of an aspect of the physical world. The Platonic or mathematical world seems to arise out of the mental world. Each of these individual processes makes sense in their own way, but the unfolding and development of all of them all occurring at once from moment to moment is difficult to reconcile. Now, don't just consider UFOs here and their connection to the physical and mental world. This is an illustration of how all phenomena are interconnected. Before I try to turn all these ideas into a predictable and testable hypothesis for UFOs as interdimensionals, let me run down 3 helpful clues that might get us there. The first is Jeremy England, an MIT physicist. He's drawn up some calculations to explain how life can emerge from non-living, non-reproducing matter. He uses the second law of thermodynamics to explain how heat exchange, dissipation of heat, can be the causal factor in how atoms and molecules bond and form the building blocks of life. It's entropy. Living things are much better at capturing energy from their environment and releasing it as heat than non-living things are. When atoms are driven by energy like the sun while surrounded by a heat bath, like an atmosphere or ocean, these atoms will restructure themselves to better dissipate heat. Reproduction, as shown here, of the building blocks are for life on other planets or even stars. The dissipation of heat could certainly qualify as something we might have in common with ET and how they might be UFOs. Complex systems like brains might be even better at it. And even more complex systems of brains communicating back and forth like we do on social media, I believe, could be seen as another way of entropy. At least I know it feels that way on Facebook sometimes. You're just blowing off steam. Trolling on Facebook can be seen as a conscious mental way of dissipating heat energy, I suppose. But seriously, second, let me introduce you to Daniel Wolpert, an MD, neuroscientist, and engineer who studies the brain and its relationship to the environment. We can imagine all sorts of reasons why we have a brain, but the most obvious and essential function of a brain is movement. That's it. Movement of muscles, movement of blood, movement to maintain balance, movement of electrical charge through a neuron. Now, what better or more precise reason could there be for why we have a brain? I would even go so far as to say that a brain responsible for movement is the most terrific way to dissipate heat, with Jeremy England's theory of finding better and better ways to evolve via entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. So, to repeat, the more complex a system is, the more ways it must move to dissipate heat energy. Complex systems of communication among beings could be a way to do this. This could certainly give other intelligences or entities the same means to move themselves and develop UFOs to move in a way that helps them succeed in dissipating heat, as we do when we're communicating. Finally, third person I want to introduce you to, since I spoke so much about the mind and its relationship to UFOs and how UFOs and ETs might as well be the same thing, I should offer a definition of mind that might tie this all together. Dan Siegel, a child psychiatrist and psychiatry professor at Harvard, has gone around the world sharing his ideas of self-regulation and mindfulness meditation. Now, as I understand the story, Siegel gathered some 40 professionals from other scientific disciplines like neuroscientists, physicists, sociologists, and anthropologists to come up with an agreed-upon definition of the mind. As you might imagine, this was no easy task. Now, you might remember I was looking for a common field that could bring together the subjective, objective, intersubjective, and interobjective aspects in integral theory. Well, take a look at this. Here's the definition they agreed on. Now, think about how this definition meets with your own experience and Jeremy England's theory and Daniel Wolpert's contention. Mind is an emergent, self-organizing process, both embodied and relational, that regulates energy and information flow within and among us. You can even reread that definition, keeping in mind what I shared about photons of light and electrons with charge, and how they bring about particles with mass in the Higgs field. Now, I don't know if you're there yet, but I'm beginning to get an idea of how to make sense of UFOs in terms of electronic fog, 90-degree impossible turns, dematerializing, and the psychophysiological effects of missing time, telepathic communication, trauma, and euphoria. UFOs, then, according to my interdimensional hypothesis, UFOs are complex systems of mind that dissipate heat through movement, which results in contact with other complex systems across space and time. And to repeat a third time, the more complex a system is, the more ways it must find to dissipate heat energy. Complex systems of communication among beings would be a natural outcome. UFOs as ETs are dissipating heat energy by sharing meaning with us in the form of an encounter, while we remain quite unaware that we are doing the same thing with them. This is the method of communication whereby we are operating in the same field or dimension as the craft and their associated entities. It also fits nicely in human history, from storied traditions of chariots of the gods, where we've had contact for thousands of years. It's how long we've had a culture. I'm also beginning to get an idea here with Penrose's Twistor Theory, how this might make sense in terms of causation being primary, where time and space are flexible, which could account for the appearance of UFOs as possessing near-future looking technology. And all of this is occurring in processes or occasions of experience in our universe in a way that is much more interesting and teaches us a lesson that we still don't understand: time and space. Now, besides string theory with its multiverses, there is another unified field theory on the horizon. It's called quantum gravity. Well, actually, quantum gravity just refers to the theory of everything, that unified field theory. What we have here is a theory from what seems to be a suspicious group called Quantum Gravity Research, a non-profit organization seeking donations that put out a YouTube video making all sorts of claims. But I'll take it seriously just for a moment because I don't want to miss anything, and because I have some friends who like this kind of stuff. This theory says every moment is creating every other moment, both forward and backward in time, or all time exists all the time. The universe is made of information, so goes this theory. Reality is a mosaic-like code or language at the smallest scale possible called the Planck length. So says Clee Irwin, director of quantum gravity research and former vitamin salesman. Irwin says we project a slice of a higher dimensional E8 crystal or lattice down to 3D, which produces a code or language. That allows geometric symbols, which are tetrahedrons, of course, since this theory has all the hallmarks of New Age woo, to build up to the ordinary world of particles and forces that we see around us. Oh, especially including Fibonacci numbers and the golden ratio. Can't leave that out. Well, more woo happens when we learn some physicists are taking seriously the notion that this whole simulation apparently requires some sort of universal collective consciousness or one conscious observer. Consciousness is all important. And somewhere along the line, we, of course, are co-creating reality, probably through some light body ascension process. The main point here is that, consciousness is the bigger deal that operates anything. Well, how about this? Maybe Clee Irwin's quantum gravity research concept of consciousness would make sense if we put it in its proper place. I mean, the context in which Roger Penrose uses it in his Three Worlds, Three Mysteries illustration. This would be where mathematical reality projects out a slice of itself to give rise to matter, matter operating according to the second law of thermodynamics, according to Jeremy England's math, gives way to self-replicating organisms dispersing heat in more and more complex systems, which gives rise to Daniel Wolpert's movement in a complex brain, which gives rise to information sharing among these organisms in a culture and eventually a mind as defined by Dan Siegel. The complexity of this mental cultural system, perhaps, is the aspect of mind that gets projected out to create Roger Penrose's Platonic or mathematical world. And around we go, I suppose, until the universe reaches thermal equilibrium at the end of an eon, which coincides with another Big Bang. Well, that's it. That's how UFO craft and ETs are interdimensionals and how it all works. What do you think? Well, before you answer that, with all the background I've laid, it's time to fulfill the promise I made earlier to make a few specific predictions. Predictions that are testable and predictions which are hopefully useful. Here they are. What I've come up with here is justification for how and why UFOs and ETs should be considered as the same thing, playing on the same field and following the same rules. So, about all I can predict has to do with the types of reports we'll be getting that will remain our only source of evidence for now. About all I can say about these reports is that reports of UFOs and UFO claims will not go away, but the craft reported will change shape, according to my hypothesis. No more flying saucers. That's what this means. The flying saucer meaning has been shared sufficiently. The craft, in other words, are going to start looking different. I also believe this IDH tells us that accounts of physical, substantial craft will have less and less resemblance to merely objective and measurable phenomena that can be verified by observation and measurement and camera phones. This means we're going to see an increase in reports that more and more cross the line in terms of their subjectivity and objectivity, continuing to be embedded in a cultural system that contains symbolic meaning to those who experience them. In other words, much more than just lights in the sky or daylight disks. We will stop taking interest in those. Just like particles in the double slit experiment, the more and more we try to capture them with our cell phones as enduring physical objects, the stranger they will behave as if they are not. but the more impact they will have on our culture and sense of meaning will be measurable in terms of the number of reports. More people will be curious. Polls will show more people believe. Finally, I think research from SETI to investigate the extraterrestrial hypothesis will fall out of favor in UFO study communities, while more and more investigation will be devoted to these experiences as non-local and that resemble this deeper dimension of reality that is rife with meaning. For my stab at a scientific IDH here are some ways it could be refuted. I will be proven wrong if there becomes less and less interest in altered states, experiences of time alteration, and the strong meaning associated with UFOs. I will be wrong if, say, in only 10 years, UFO study groups like ours are still fixated and obsessed with reports of craft that don't involve some kind of intelligent entity. We will be focused on getting technology to work through us via some kind of cybernetic connection, as opposed to building lifeless machines that can take us somewhere. My nod to Dave Paris, who I'll mention in a second. Now, I suppose I'll only be partly wrong if a UFO shows up on the White House lawn and a weird-looking ET walks down a ramp. So I'll just say my IDH tells me I really doubt this will happen. My hypothesis does not predict this, and it most definitely won't look like a saucer. Now, maybe a triangle, but not a saucer or the Venusian craft, because that information has already been shared with us and has dissipated. In other words, I'll be proven wrong if UFOs don't turn out to be something much more interesting than just visiting extraterrestrials from other star systems. Now, if there is an overarching purpose to the scientific method, it's about asking better questions. So if you don't care for this approach, I hope it helps you to ask more questions, such as, is this approach useful? Well, you tell me. Tell me if, when a good trusted friend of yours comes to tell you about a UFO experience, how will you treat them? Will this cause you to lose a friend, medicate them, or commit them? Or will it cause you to listen closely to what they say and have them carefully describe what happened and then what the experience meant to them in a way they feel understood, or at least not embarrassed to share something with you that is so personal and profound? Second, does this presentation leave you with complete disinterest on the subject of UFOs? Or is a part of you now a little more genuinely interested in how the universe, matter, life, and mind actually work scientifically, and how UFOs might still be a part of it? Finally, if you have had or if you do have an experience yourself of seeing a UFO, what are you going to do? Are you going to ignore it and pretend like it didn't happen? Or are you going to really try to understand what happened to you in an effort to figure out your place in this universe and ask better questions until you get an answer? I will close with Carl Sagan's most famous quotation. We are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Now, Carl Sagan saw zero evidence, zilch nada, when it comes to UFOs and ETs, so I know he probably would not have appreciated this. But I'm ready to say it. UFOs are too. UFOs are made of star stuff. UFOs are a way for the cosmos to know itself. Feel free to visit OmahaUFOStudyGroup.com or like the UFO MUFON Society on Facebook, where I often hang out. See my other YouTube videos and playlists, or check out the new Spooky Action at a Distance TV show with Kyle Finley to hear some more interesting connections between discoveries in modern science and the paranormal. Feel free also to connect with my friend Dave Paris and his work on space warp dynamics at his website here or on YouTube and Facebook, and wish him the best in his ongoing lab work to find terrestrial energy solutions. These are lifeless machines that'll take us places, and perhaps even a means for interstellar travel someday. Thank you, and thanks for watching.